October 30th, 2014, Kansas City, Missouri. There's an exciting buzz in the air as local families prepare to celebrate Halloween.
Halloween is a lot of fun in Kansas City. In a matter of hours, the city will be bursting with trick-or-treaters, wild parties, and haunted houses.
But for local law enforcement, this time of year also means an uptick in crime.
Kansas City, like many other large metropolitan cities, has a crime issue. What's somewhat unique about Kansas City in particular is that much of our violent crime is committed by younger individuals.
We annually make the list of top cities for crime and violence.
So when gunshots ring out at 1 a.m. on Kansas City's south side, patrol officers are ready to spring into action.
Officers responded to the area where those gunshots were.
This is a dangerous area of Kansas City. The officers knew that this particular area was a place where drugs were commonly sold, used, and things of that nature.
A gold-colored sedan catches the officer's attention.
It was running with its lights on and all the doors were shut.
Officers cautiously approach the vehicle.
Jackson County Sheriff's Department, step out with your hands up.
They issue instruction to the occupant of the vehicle, come out.
Nothing happens. They try yelling louder.
Step out.
But no one comes out of the vehicle.
Eventually, one of the officers opens the driver's door.
They see what can only be described as a deceased individual with an apparent gunshot wound to his head.
Dispatch, go ahead and start homicide. We got 110-7.
Homicide detectives are on the scene within minutes.
They know they have a dead body, and now they want to identify that body.
Fortunately, the victim's wallet is still inside the car.
In his wallet, they find the driver's license, and that's when they're able to identify him as Mr. Deontay Green.
22-year-old Deontay Green always exuded love and light.
To know him was to love him. He had a heart of gold.
Deontay was a ball of energy. Like, he was so energetic. Goofy, play all day. He was himself at all times.
He was an active member in the community. He was a part of the Kansas City Marching Cobras. He was a part of the Kansas City Falcons, another drill team.
He had style. He used to dress from head to toe.
But nothing meant more to Deontay than his twin daughters, Diana and Tiana.
They were the center of his life.
You just look at them and you can see Deontay. When we were with him, it would just be a fun moment. Like, we'll laugh, play around, take pictures, just hang out. When it came to us, it was about us.
Deontay and his high school sweetheart, Kiana Rice, had become parents when they were still teenagers.
Even though their relationship fizzled out, they stayed close for their girls.
They was very good co-parenting the kids. They've been knowing each other all their lives, so they were like two peas in a pod. They were best friends.
By the fall of 2014, Deontay was ready to find love again.
Deontay was an openly bisexual man and began looking for love online.
He was looking for these avenues to try and find ways to connect with people, whether it be social media via Facebook or what have you.
He was very active in the LGBTQ community of Kansas City.
And for Deontay, part of being a member of the LGBTQ+ community meant giving back.
Deontay was a part of the House of Cavalli. He was also a part of Authentic. Those two organizations by itself, I can just go on and on about the different things that they've done. They're very active in their community as far as feeding the homeless, as far as going to go clean up communities. Wherever he could have his hand in, he was in.
He affected each person, and everyone loved him.
So how did he end up on the other side of town with a bullet to the head?
Detectives started to investigate the crime scene to see if there were any clues that may lead them to who was the killer of this young man.
They see an entry wound to the right of his right eye, but no exit wound.
There was stippling around the gunshot wound.
When a gunshot is fired, if you are close enough to the target, it will actually leave stippling, which are small burn marks that are left by the gunpowder. And so that would indicate that the shooter was within approximately a foot of Deontay when the bullet was fired.
Detectives believe the shooter fired their gun from the back seat of the vehicle.
On the floorboard of the back seat, they find a shell casing, and the caliber of that shell casing is what's called a 400 Corbon.
The only way you can fire the 400 Corbon round is with a modified .45 caliber handgun.
400 Corbon isn't a very common round. It's certainly not a very common round that you see used in criminal acts.
Was Deontay the unfortunate victim of a robbery gone wrong?
Certainly, if it was a robbery, the perpetrators would want to take anything of value that they could find.
But he still has his wallet.
That certainly indicated that this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill robbery.
However, there is one key item missing.
His cell phone was gone. Why would the killer take his phone and not his wallet?
"22-year-old father of two, Deontay Green, was ready to find love again.
He had 2 twin daughters, but the relationship with their mother turned out to be more like a friendship.
He was an openly bisexual man. He was very active in the LGBTQ community of Kansas City.
But just after 1 a.m. on October 31st, 2014, investigators have found Deontay on Kansas City's seedy South Side with a gunshot wound to the head.
It was a mystery how Deontay even ended up in this part of town. He was an upstanding guy.
Was this a robbery? Was this somebody he knew? Was this an isolated incident? Was this something planned?
Oddly enough, the killer appeared to take his cell phone and not his wallet. Why would they do that if this was a robbery?
Before they can answer that question, detectives have the grim task of notifying Deontay's loved ones of what's transpired.
I guess it was about 11 a.m. in the morning. A knock is at the door, and there are 2 detectives. And they're asking me if Deontay Green lives here. Yes.
Yes, I'm his mother. He's been living with me recently.
That's when detectives deliver the heartbreaking news.
All I can remember him saying is, "Miss Green, your son was murdered." I don't know what happened after that.
Murdered last night.
I'm hurt and I'm in disbelief. Like, no, not my son. It was the most horrific thing I've ever had to endure or encounter.
Where did you find him?
On the south side, in an area with a lot of crime and drug activity.
Was Deontay involved in any kind of illegal drugs?
Ms. Green was very surprised over the question.
Absolutely not.
My son didn't do drugs. I did everything within me to make sure the streets don't swallow him up. He didn't hang around that type of crowd. I'm puzzled as to what he was even doing down there.
Deontay was an outstanding citizen. It was a part of town that Deontay Green would not otherwise have been in, unless somebody else told him to go there.
Can you think of any reason why someone would want to harm your son?
I drew a blank because I couldn't think of not one individual that would want to harm him in such a manner. He didn't have any enemies.
He was just a likable person that everybody liked because he tried to do the right thing all the time.
I told them if I had to point a finger or anything, it was because of his sexuality, him being bisexual.
Was Deontay the victim of a callous hate crime?
Homophobia is still an open discussion within this society, and not everybody seems to understand the dynamics around it. So when Deontay was killed, police had to take this into account with their investigation.
When was the last time you saw your son?
Last night around 11.
He say, Mom, I'm about to go grab something to eat with some friends. And I say, okay, love you, be good. And he said, okay, I love you too. I'll be back.
All right, see you later, Mama.
Okay.
My son told me he was coming back to me.
Detectives now wonder if the friends Deontay said he was going out with that night turned out to be killers.
Do you have names for the individuals he was going to hang out with?
Unfortunately, no.
Thank you so much for your time, Miss Green, and again, we're so sorry for your loss.
Thank you, detectives.
As investigators scour Kansas City for Deontay's killer, news of his death echoes throughout the community.
A couple of days after his death, we did a memorial.
I honestly didn't think that I would walk into a memorial with over 300 people. It was huge. It was really beautiful because a lot of people that was there has showed how much they cared and loved him.
The outpour of love and support that the city showed my family and I spoke volumes of who Deontay was.
For investigators, it's puzzling that anyone would seek to harm such a beloved member of the community like Deontay Green.
They were really having trouble piecing together how and why this happened.
Until a young man named Greg Bailey shows up at the station to speak with them.
What can I do for you?
This gentleman has some information for you.
Okay, come on in.
Greg was Deontay's good friend, and he told detectives that he might have some vital information about the last hours of his life.
He is really the person who broke the case open for the most part.
Okay, Greg, tell us what you know.
Greg tells detectives that on the night of the 30th, Deontay made plans to meet up with a mysterious young man he'd met on Facebook.
He didn't know the name of the individual that Deontay was meeting up with, but Deontay had described him as cute and having dreads.
Deontay told him that there was something about this guy in this picture that pulled him in.
However, was Deontay's handsome suitor really a wolf in sheep's clothing?
He said we could meet up, but there's something I need you to bring me.
He says this is something that we can keep between us.
Kansas City detectives investigating the murder of 22-year-old Deontay Green are finally getting their first lead, thanks to Deontay's best friend, Greg Bailey.
He said Deontay was looking to meet up with a mysterious individual on the night of the 30th.
They've been talking online. On Facebook?
But according to Greg, Deontay's mysterious suitor had a stipulation for their meetup.
He said we could meet up, but there's something I need you to bring me.
The guy requested that Deontay would bring some marijuana with him.
Deontay didn't do drugs, wasn't into it, so he told the man if he brought the money and knew somewhere to go get the weed, that he would take him.
The whole thing seemed kind of sketchy to me. I told Deontay it was a bad idea.
He tried to discourage him. Deontay Green decided to go anyway.
Greg tells detectives Deontay called him around midnight, after he arrived to meet his date.
He still hasn't arrived yet?
No, I'm still sitting here, waiting.
And then Deontay started to see a guy walking towards the car.
But the man wasn't alone.
Wait, there's another guy.
Another guy?
It was another guy coming out with them, and he didn't know what he was coming out for.
Hey, you doing okay? Yeah, how are you? Good. Sorry, we actually gotta go to the gas station first to get cash, if that's okay. Oh, yeah. That's okay, you sure? Yeah. Okay, yeah, all right. Yeah. Thank you, man, thank you. Hey, Greg, I'll call you later, okay?
Be careful, just call me later.
After that, Greg never heard from his best friend again.
After speaking with Greg, investigators are eager to access Deontay's social media account to see exactly who he was messaging to meet up with that night.
Law enforcement obtains a search warrant for the Facebook account of Deontay Green.
When they logged in, they noticed that Deontay had a ton of friends. It was obvious that Deontay was very well liked.
But it doesn't take long for them to locate the message thread they are looking for.
They can see that there is communication between Deontay Green and an individual with the Facebook handle Trey the Gunner, and it carries through to the early morning hours of Halloween.
The conversation starts with Deontay Green reaching out innocently, just simply reaching out, saying hello. Pretty quickly after that individual learned of Deontay Green's sexual preference, had learned that the reason he reached out to him was in a flirtatious manner or a romantic nature, he was appalled. He was insulted.
Trey's responses become aggressive at times.
He even told him if he keeps coming at him, he's going to beat him up.
Deontay respected his decision, and the conversation dropped. But not for long.
Later on, that same individual had a change of heart.
And at some point in their communication, they were flirting back and forth.
Deontay felt like the guy was actually interested, but may be scared or have some fear about meeting up with him.
Deontay would respond that this is something that we can keep between us.
Sometimes gay men or bisexual men have this battle internally with being open and being accepting of who they are versus the homophobia that is around them. So if you could imagine, being able to link or meet up with someone who is saying they're not gay, but they're expressing some interest, it can be validating or give a sense of acceptance to an openly gay or bisexual person.
In the very last message, Deontay gave Trey the Gunner his phone number, and then the messages stopped.
Detectives are eager to discover Trey the Gunner's real name so they can track him down for an interview.
If Trey the Gunner had actually texted Deontay, the officers could trace the number back to the real person.
When detectives obtain Deontay's phone records, they discover one particular number was in contact with Deontay 80 times the night he was killed.
They thought this must be Trey the Gunner.
They are able to trace the number to an individual by the name of Antonio Golston.
But Antonio Golston looks nothing like the man Deontay had been messaging with on Facebook.
He appeared to have a total different Facebook page that had no contact with Deontay.
Regardless, detectives want to speak with Antonio Golston ASAP.
Detectives tracked him down and brought him into the station for questioning.
Just show you this picture. You know anything about this guy at all?
No, sir.
They asked him, how did he know the name Deontay Green? But he said the name doesn't ring a bell.
Well, there's a reason we've ended up here today, okay? Mm-hmm. You're saying you've never talked with him before over the phone?
No, sir.
Or via text?
No, sir.
At this point, detectives decide to turn up the heat.
We're working a death investigation, all right?
Yes, sir.
This guy that you're looking at, we found him dead.
Detectives confront him with the phone records, and they show that they have proof that he called him the night that Deontay died.
What we need you to do is just explain to us why your number is in his phone.
They ask him why. Why are you the last person to talk with Deontay Green before he was murdered?
I think you're nervous. I think you're scared. But we need to get over that. We need to move forward, okay?
All I can say is just telephone my cousin Trey. And that's it.
When Antonio says the name Trey, detectives' ears perk up.
Was he the Trey the gunner they've been looking for?
You gotta find him.
In the fall of 2014, Kansas City detectives finally have a suspect in custody for the murder of 22-year-old Deontay Green.
Antonio Goldston's phone number communicated with Deontay's roughly 80 times on the night of his murder.
But Antonio denies any involvement in Deontay's death.
I never talked to the guy or texted the guy in my life.
Investigators were confident they caught Antonio in a lie, but he claimed he had a perfect explanation for all of this.
Antonio Goldston's response is, "My cousin had my phone."
According to Antonio, his cousin Trey Shaw had asked to borrow his phone on the 30th.
Because his phone had been stolen. He gave his cousin his phone.
I don't know whatever Trey did, I didn't come from there that night. Like, pretty much, I was still at home.
And so Antonio Goldston tells the officers that it is his cousin, Trey, who was conversating with Deontay Green before Deontay Green was murdered.
So Trey's texting him?
Yes.
Okay. And what's he look like?
Light skin, dreads.
They showed him photographs of Trey DeGunna on Facebook, and he confirmed that that was his cousin.
All I can say is just telephone my cousin Trey. And that's it.
With Antonio's help, investigators quickly locate 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw.
They were able to bring him in for an interview. Trayvon denies any knowledge of ever knowing Deontay, ever being with Deontay, or anything of that nature.
That's when detectives confront him with the Facebook messages.
Man, no, those have to be fake.
He swears he's straight and would never agree to go out with a man.
Come on, Trey.
Look, man, that's not me. I don't know what to tell you.
Detectives aren't buying any of this.
As frustrating as it was, detectives did not have enough evidence to arrest Trayvon.
So they're forced to release him for the time being.
Before they let him go, though, they gathered his fingerprints.
As days pass, without any new developments in the case, Deontay's mother never gives up hope that her son's killer will be brought to justice.
I mean, day in and day out, I'm calling the detectives that had Deontay's case. I'm going to get answers. Deontay Green case would not go cold. I was hell-bent on not giving up, and I just was adamant in saying, this case will not go just thrown on the desk. This case will be solved.
And the pressure Cochelle keeps on detectives is not in vain.
Based on the information they learned from Deontay's best friend, Greg, detectives believe that Deontay drove his killers to a gas station on the night of his murder.
Officers start scanning the area for gas stations, and they come across I believe it's a Shell gas station.
So they go to the Shell gas station and they look through that surveillance video, and what they find is the break in the case.
That's it.
They see the gold Dodge Stratus that Deontay was driving pull up to the Shell gas station.
In the passenger seat is a young man with locks.
A young man that looks just like 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw.
The individual gets out of the front passenger seat and attempts to withdraw money out of an ATM before going back out to the vehicle, getting in and the vehicle drives off.
They have a suspect matching Trayvon Shaw's description exiting the Dodge Stratus at the Shell gas station right before the homicide.
And fingerprint results provide another smoking gun.
Investigators were able to lift some fingerprints from Deontay's vehicle.
When it comes back, the fingerprint on the passenger compartment of the Dodge Stratus that Deontay Green was murdered in matches Trayvon Shaw.
At this point, investigators are prepared to take down Trayvon Shaw for the murder of Deontay Green.
With guns drawn, detectives bang on the door demanding that Trayvon come out with his hands up.
Police, open up! Don't make this harder than it has to be, Trey.
But Trayvon has no plans to go in willingly this time.
Officers made entry. Trayvon Shaw fled upstairs.
He was going to do whatever he needed to evade arrest.
On November 6, 2014, Kansas City investigators are in the process of arresting 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw, their #1 suspect in the murder of Deontay Green.
Don't make this harder than it has to be, Trey.
But Trayvon is not going down easy.
At that time, officers made entry.
Police!
Trayvon Shaw fled upstairs and barricaded himself in an upstairs bedroom. They went inside. They found Trayvon Shaw hiding in the closet.
Put your hands up! Turn around.
They arrested him without incident.
Trayvon Shaw, you're under arrest for the murder of Deontay Green.
Back in the interrogation room, detectives waste no time confronting Trey with the new evidence they've collected.
What do you have to say about this?
Man, that's not me.
The footage is a little fuzzy, so at first, Trayvon denies that the man in the car is him.
However, Trayvon is quickly caught in his lie.
The same shoes he was wearing the night of the homicide on the surveillance video is the same shoes he was wearing during his interview at the police station.
As if that wasn't enough, they then tell him his fingerprints are a match to the ones found inside Deontay's car.
And they show him the fingerprint that was lifted off of the passenger compartment. And Trayvon Shaw can't lie anymore.
He said he didn't want to be a snitch, but he couldn't take the heat any longer.
It was all my cousin Antonio's idea.
According to Trayvon, he was hanging out at Antonio's place when Deontay messaged him on social media.
They ran in similar circles and had seen each other around town before. But this was the first time they had really spoken.
You gonna do it? I think you should do it.
Trey assured the detectives that he was straight and preferred women.
But Trey says his cousin encouraged him to play the part.
And Antonio encouraged him to pretend that he was actually interested in meeting up for a date.
Nah, check it out. Look, we're all that we, right?
Yeah.
And we both need money, right?
That is true.
Yeah. So this is our chance.
Antonio Goldston told him he was going to rob Deontay Green.
And Trey would be the bait.
You in?
Yeah, let's do it.
That's when Trey the Gunner started to respond again to Deontay and said they could meet up if he could get him some weed.
Text.
The duo used Antonio's phone to text back and forth with Deontay before meeting up with him.
When Deontay thought he was texting with Trayvon, he was actually texting with Antonio.
The duo met up with Deontay around midnight on the 31st, and Trayvon says he could tell Deontay was caught off guard by Antonio.
When they met up, it was a surprise because there was another guy. Where did he come from? Who is he? Why is he here?
Regardless, Deontay played it cool and agreed to help them obtain the marijuana they wanted.
Deontay drove them to the gas station to get cash.
Trey pretended to get the money for the weed out of the ATM, when in reality, his account was empty, and they planned on stealing the funds from Deontay.
Trayvon says Deontay drove them to the Southside neighborhood where he believed they'd be purchasing the marijuana. And that's when all hell broke loose.
Give me your wallet. Wait, what? Give me your wallet. Man, get the hell out of my car.
His story is that Golston pulled out the firearm and there was a struggle. And then all he knows is the gun went off.
Oh, damn.
And now you've got a dead body and 2 people in the vehicle and a robbery gone wrong.
Trayvon explains they couldn't find Deontay's wallet in the panic, so all they left with was his phone.
They took the phone since it was just lying there.
It happened so fast. I didn't know what to do. Antonio took off, so I followed him.
Was Antonio really the mastermind all along? Or was Trayvon just trying to cover for himself?
When analyzing the data from Antonio Golston's cell phone, they come across photographs of Antonio holding firearms. They also find text messages in which Antonio is telling another individual that he recently got a 400 korban.
With this new evidence in tow, detectives circle back around to Antonio.
They started by confronting him with Trey's statement.
We only have one side of the story right now. And that story paints a gruesome picture. I mean, it sounds like a Lifetime movie.
They give him one final opportunity to give his version of the events. He again denies any knowledge of what happened to Deontay Green.
So detectives change course.
You mess with guns at all? You ever do like any Facebook photos with guns or anything like that? No, sir. You have any guns that you keep at your house for safety?
No.
Protection? Carry guns with you? What about?
I don't do guns, period.
But detectives are prepared to catch Antonio in his lie.
We have a search warrant for the phone.
Okay.
Detectives are going through it.
Okay.
There's pictures of you taking selfies. There's pictures of you with holding guns on that phone.
Detectives just tell him point blank, Antonio, you're full of and they all have a good laugh about it. It's like a child being caught. There's nothing for him to do but laugh at how unbelievable his own story is.
You were there.
I really wasn't there. No, I wasn't. I'm done talking. Take him to the cell.
I mean, that's it. That's how you want to leave it.
Like that. Because, like, y'all ain't gonna believe me anyways. Just take him to the cell.
Investigators now have enough evidence to charge both Antonio Golston and Trayvon Shaw with second-degree murder. But Deontay's family still has a tough road ahead of them.
Well, Trayvon Shaw, he wasn't the gunman. So it was like, do we really want to go to trial against him, or would you like to take a plea deal? My response, absolutely not.
Now we have to go to trial. Now we have to look these people in the eye that killed Deontay and took him from us.
His killers or killer will be brought to justice. This is the last thing I did.
In June 2015, investigators in Kansas City have finally charged 21-year-old Antonio Golston and 18-year-old Trayvon Shaw for the death of Deontay Green.
It felt so good to know that now we have the guys, but the hardest part was now we have to go to trial. Now we have to look these people in the eye that killed Deontay and took him from us.
Between the phone records and Trayvon's statement, prosecutors feel certain a jury will convict Antonio. But they aren't as confident about securing a conviction against Trayvon.
It was kind of like a 50-50, they said. It was a lot of circumstantial evidence. They didn't have the murder weapon, and he wasn't the trigger man.
But Cochelle is determined to see both men face justice for her son's death.
The prosecutors asked, would you like to take a plea deal? My response, absolutely not. No, I'm going to trust in God and I'm going to go. Let's do the trial. His killers will be brought to justice. This is the last thing I did.
In May of 2016, Trayvon Shaw's trial begins. Prosecutors explain why Trayvon was an integral part of what happened to Deontay, even though he didn't pull the trigger.
Deontay Green had reached out to Trayvon Shaw innocently, hoping for some type of connection. Trayvon Shaw and Antonio Goldston learned that pretty quickly, and they knew they could exploit that.
You in? Yeah.
Deontay Green was there for Trayvon Shaw. He wasn't there for Antonio Goldston.
However, when the jury retires to deliberate, they decide to show Trayvon mercy.
Instead of second-degree murder, he was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to only 17 years in prison.
The jury agreed that Trayvon Shaw took part, but I think the jury believed, hey, he knew this was a robbery, but he didn't think it was going to be a murder.
It's a disappointing verdict for Deontay's loved ones.
I get that he wasn't the trigger man, but he's the sole purpose and reason why we're here. It was because of him.
At Antonio Goldston's trial in the winter of 2016, he continues to maintain his original story, that he wasn't even there that night.
His story was he wasn't even in the car the night that my son was killed. He was so nonchalant. It was ridiculous.
However, just like Trayvon's case, the jury at Antonio's trial forgoes second-degree murder charges.
Antonio Goldston, at the end of his trial, was convicted of 1 count of voluntary manslaughter, 2 counts of armed criminal action, and 1 count of robbery in the first degree.
Antonio is sentenced to just 25 years behind bars.
25 years still isn't enough. When he get out, he'll still have a life. His mother can still call him. He can still call his mother. They can still visit. I can't talk to my son. I have to remember our last conversation of saying, I love you, be good, I'll see you later. Or I have to go to a grave site to visit my son, or look at pictures to remember him.
When both of the guys were found guilty, it made me feel a little bit relieved, but it didn't bring him back. So, I mean, it was hard. It's still hard.
Today, Deontay's legacy continues to live on through his twin daughters, Diana and Tiana.
When Deontay passed away, Diana and Tiana were 7 years old. We just ramble about him sometimes. We had memories. Just hearing his voice or just seeing him, that's one thing I really do miss about my father. Everything we do is for him. We will follow into his footsteps, make sure that everyone remembers who my father was. He's never forgotten.
Deontay wanted everybody to be comfortable with who you were. If I could walk away and say anything about Deontay Green was one word: love. Love, love, love. Love.
On a cold October night in Chicago, beneath the yellow glow of streetlights and the endless noise of a city that never truly sleeps, a 17-year-old boy walked alone along a dark stretch of South Pulaski Road. His name was Laquan Joseph McDonald. At that moment, he was not a symbol. He was not a headline. He was not a name repeated across television screens, newspapers, and courtroom conversations across America. He was simply a teenager. A young person who had lived through more struggles than most people his age could imagine. A teenager carrying the weight of a difficult childhood, trying to navigate a world that had often failed to protect him. But on that night, October 20th, 2014, his life would end in a matter of seconds. And what happened afterward would become a battle over truth itself. Because somewhere inside the darkness of that night was a small camera mounted on a police vehicle. A silent witness. A piece of technology that captured everything. A recording that would eventually force an entire city to confront a painful question. What happens when the official story is not the whole story? For 13 months, that video remained hidden from the public. For 13 months, the people of Chicago were asked to believe a version of events that described a dangerous encounter, a frightened officer, and a justified shooting. The official reports told a story of a young man who allegedly moved toward police officers with a knife, creating a threat that left an officer with no choice but to fire. But inside that sealed video file was another story. A story told not through words, but through images. A story that would shake Chicago. A story that would become one of the most controversial police shootings in modern American history. On the night Laquan McDonald died, the city around him continued moving. Cars passed through intersections. People walked home from work. Restaurants closed their doors. Families sat inside their houses, unaware that a moment was unfolding just a few miles away that would eventually become a national conversation about justice, accountability, and trust. The call that brought police to South Pulaski Road seemed like many other emergency calls officers respond to every day. A teenager was reportedly carrying a knife. There were complaints that someone was damaging vehicles. Police officers were dispatched to investigate. Multiple squad cars arrived. The situation was tense, but at first glance, it appeared to be another encounter between police and a young person in a troubled neighborhood. But within minutes, everything changed. Officer Jason Van Dyke arrived at the scene. He stepped out of his vehicle. And according to the evidence later revealed, within only a few seconds, he raised his weapon and fired. 16 times. 16 bullets. 16 moments that would later be examined in a courtroom. 16 shots that transformed the name Laquan McDonald from an unknown teenager into a symbol of a much larger national debate. The official explanation given afterward was clear. Police said Laquan had acted aggressively. They said he moved toward officers. They said he posed an immediate threat. But the camera recording from the police vehicle showed something dramatically different. It showed a teenager walking away. It showed distance between Laquan and the officer. It showed a young man falling to the ground after the first shots. And it showed the gunfire continuing even after he was no longer standing. For the public, however, those images did not exist yet. They were locked away. Hidden behind legal arguments, government decisions, and a system that many people believed was protecting itself rather than revealing the truth. During that year of silence, Laquan McDonald's family lived with unanswered questions. They knew their son was gone. They knew he would never come home. But they did not have the full picture of what happened during his final moments. They had no video. They had no public evidence. They had only statements from authorities describing their child as a threat. For a grieving family, that uncertainty created another kind of pain. The pain of wondering whether the person they loved was being remembered fairly. The pain of hearing strangers describe their son without knowing the person behind the headlines. Because before Laquan became the center of a national controversy, he was a teenager with his own fears, hopes, and dreams. He was a child who had experienced instability early in life. He had spent time within the state's child welfare system. He had faced emotional and psychological challenges. Like many young people growing up surrounded by difficult circumstances, he was not a simple story. He was not just a police report. He was a human being. A teenager whose life contained both struggles and moments of ordinary youth. But on October 20, 2014, the final chapter of his life would be written on an empty road in Chicago. And for more than a year, the world would not know exactly what happened there. The controversy surrounding Laquan McDonald's death was not only about the shooting itself. It was also about what happened afterward. Why was the video not immediately released? Why did the first public descriptions of the incident differ so greatly from what the recording appeared to show? Why did it take a lawsuit and a court order before the public could see the evidence? Those questions would eventually become impossible to ignore. Journalists began investigating. Community activists demanded answers. Legal battles intensified. And slowly, the pressure grew. The city of Chicago found itself facing a decision. Continue protecting the secrecy surrounding the video, or release the images that could change everything. On November 24, 2015, more than a year after Laquan McDonald's death, the video was finally made public. Millions of people watched. And within hours, the conversation changed forever. The images contradicted the story many people had previously heard. The video did not show the dramatic confrontation described in initial reports. Instead, it showed a moment that forced viewers to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The release of that footage created shock, anger, and grief throughout Chicago. People filled the streets. Protests erupted. Communities demanded accountability. The city that had kept the video hidden was now forced to confront the consequences of that decision. For many residents, the question was no longer only about one officer and one shooting. It became a question about transparency. About power. About whether institutions can be trusted to investigate themselves. The case would eventually lead to criminal charges against Jason Van Dyke. It would bring national attention to the issue of police accountability. It would influence conversations about body cameras, public access to evidence, and the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. But before all of that happened, there was only one thing. One video. One teenager. One night. And one unanswered question hanging over Chicago. If that camera had not existed, if that footage had never been discovered, would the world have ever known the full story of what happened to Laquan McDonald? The answer to that question is what turned this case into something larger than a single tragedy. It became a story about memory. A story about truth. A story about how a silent camera, sitting unnoticed on a police vehicle, would eventually speak louder than thousands of words. And it would force an entire city to look directly at a moment many people wish they could have ignored. Chicago has always been a city of contrasts. A place where towering skyscrapers rise above the shores of Lake Michigan, where millions of people build businesses, raise families, and chase dreams beneath the bright lights of downtown. But beyond the famous skyline, beyond the tourist attractions and the busy streets filled with commuters, there are neighborhoods where life tells a very different story. Neighborhoods shaped by decades of economic struggle, political battles, violence, and mistrust between residents and the institutions meant to protect them. In the southwest and west sides of Chicago, many communities had long carried the burden of problems that were much larger than any single person. Unemployment. Poverty. Limited opportunities. Violence that passed from one generation to another. And a complicated relationship between residents and the Chicago Police Department. For many people living in these neighborhoods, police officers were both necessary and controversial. They were the people called when danger arrived. They were the ones expected to respond when families needed help. But they were also representatives of a system that many residents believed had failed them repeatedly. Years of complaints about excessive force, aggressive policing tactics, and a lack of accountability had created deep wounds. Many residents felt that their voices were ignored. Many officers felt they were working in extremely difficult conditions, facing danger every day. Between those two realities existed a fragile relationship built on tension and uncertainty. And it was inside this environment that the story of Laquan McDonald unfolded. In October 2014, Chicago was already struggling with questions about violence and policing. The city had experienced years of debate over how law enforcement operated in communities where trust had become fragile. The Chicago Police Department was one of the largest police forces in the United States. Thousands of officers patrolled neighborhoods every day. Most calls they answered were routine. Traffic stops, noise complaints, domestic disputes, reports of suspicious activity. But some calls carried a different level of risk. Calls involving weapons. Calls involving young people in unpredictable situations. Calls where officers had only seconds to make decisions. The night Laquan McDonald died began with one of those calls. It was October 20, 2014. The evening air in Chicago was cool. The streets around South Pulaski Road were illuminated by streetlights and passing vehicles. It was not the middle of the night. Life was still happening around the area. Cars moved through the neighborhood. Businesses remained open. People continued with their daily routines. But for Laquan, that night would become the final moments of his life. At 17 years old, he was standing at a difficult crossroads. Like many teenagers, he was still trying to understand himself and his place in the world. But unlike many teenagers, Laquan had already experienced hardships that forced him to grow up too quickly. His childhood had been marked by instability. He spent part of his early life within the state child welfare system. He struggled emotionally. He faced challenges that shaped the way he interacted with the world around him. People who knew him described a young person who was not simply defined by his problems. Behind the reports and accusations was a teenager with a personality, memories, and people who cared about him. But in communities like those where Laquan lived, young people often became trapped between two different realities. They were expected to survive difficult environments while also being judged by the same circumstances surrounding them. A teenager walking through a neighborhood at night could be viewed through many different lenses. To some, he was simply a young person. To others, he represented danger. Those perceptions mattered. Because in situations involving police and civilians, perception can influence decisions within seconds. And on that October night, those seconds would determine whether Laquan would return home. Before the confrontation with police, the city itself had already been dealing with a larger crisis. Chicago had become a national symbol in debates about crime and policing. Politicians argued about public safety. Community leaders demanded reforms. Police officials defended their officers and emphasized the dangers they faced. But behind all the statistics and political arguments were individual people. Officers. Residents. Families. Teenagers. People whose lives could change in a single moment. The relationship between police and communities is often built from thousands of small interactions. A respectful conversation. A difficult arrest. A moment of cooperation. Or, sometimes, a moment of fear and violence. For many residents in Chicago's neighborhoods, experiences with police shaped how they viewed every future encounter. A person who trusted officers might interpret a situation differently from someone who had experienced discrimination or mistreatment. A police officer who had faced previous threats might approach a situation differently from someone who had not. These human experiences created a complicated environment where every interaction carried history. And that history surrounded the events of October 20, 2014. When officers received the report about a person carrying a knife, they were entering a situation filled with uncertainty. They did not know exactly what they would find. They did not know what Laquan was thinking. They did not know how the next few minutes would unfold. But what happened next would later become one of the most closely examined police encounters in American history. At approximately 9:57 p.m., multiple police vehicles moved toward the area near South Pulaski Road. Officers responded to reports of a teenager allegedly damaging vehicles and carrying a knife. The details of those initial reports would later become part of a much larger investigation. Questions would emerge about what officers saw, what they believed, what they reported, and what the evidence actually showed. The officers arriving at the scene were entering a moment where decisions had to be made quickly. Police training often emphasizes the importance of evaluating threats, distance, movement, behavior, weapons, the actions of the person involved. But later, critics would argue that the response to Laquan was shaped by assumptions rather than the reality captured on video. The central question became simple but deeply controversial. Was Laquan McDonald truly an immediate threat at the moment he was shot? Or was something else happening in those final seconds? The answer would come from the video. But before the public saw that footage, the city would spend more than a year hearing only one side of the story. The official narrative. The version written in reports. The version that described an officer reacting to danger. During that year, the absence of the video created a strange reality. A case involving a deadly shooting existed without the most important piece of evidence being available to the public. The community knew a teenager had died. They knew police had fired their weapons. But they did not know exactly how those final moments unfolded. The silence surrounding the video became almost as significant as the shooting itself. Because evidence does not only reveal what happened. Sometimes, the absence of evidence being shared becomes part of the story. And in Chicago, that silence would eventually become impossible to ignore. As the months passed, pressure continued to build. Journalists questioned the official account. Activists demanded transparency. Laquan's family continued seeking answers. The city faced increasing questions about why the public had not been allowed to see what the camera had captured. But at the center of everything was still a 17-year-old boy. A teenager whose life ended on a street in Chicago. A teenager whose final moments would become a national debate. Before the protests. Before the courtroom battles. Before the political consequences. There was only Laquan. A young person whose story began long before the night of October 20, 2014. And to understand why his death affected so many people, it was necessary to look beyond the police reports and the headlines. It was necessary to understand the person behind the name. Because every case begins with a victim. And every victim has a story that existed before the tragedy, before his name became known across America, before his face appeared on television screens and newspaper covers, before politicians and activists debated the meaning of his final moments. Laquan Joseph McDonald was simply a teenager trying to find his way through a complicated world. He was 17 years old. An age when many young people are still discovering who they are. An age when the future feels endless, when mistakes can still be corrected, when there is supposed to be time to grow, learn, and change. But Laquan's life had never been simple. His childhood carried challenges that many people his age never had to experience. He grew up surrounded by instability, moving through a system that often placed children in situations where survival became more important than childhood itself. Like many young people who experience trauma early in life, Laquan carried invisible struggles. The kind that cannot always be seen by strangers walking past him on the street. The kind that cannot be understood through a short police report or a few sentences describing an encounter. Because behind every headline is a human being. Behind every case file is a person who once laughed, talked, worried, dreamed, and imagined a future. Laquan was not born as a news story. He was born as someone's child. Someone's family member. Someone's friend. And before October 20, 2014, he was still writing his own story. Laquan Joseph McDonald was born on September 25, 1996. From an early age, his life was shaped by difficult circumstances. He experienced instability at home and spent time within Illinois child welfare system. For a young child, being placed into state care can create feelings of uncertainty that are difficult to explain. A child who enters such a system often has questions that adults cannot easily answer. Where will I live? Who will take care of me? Will things ever feel normal? Will someone stay? These experiences can leave lasting emotional marks. For Laquan, those struggles followed him into his teenage years. He faced mental health challenges and received treatment for emotional difficulties. But those struggles were only one part of who he was. They did not define him. They did not erase his personality. They did not erase the fact that he was still a teenager. Those who knew him remembered different parts of his character. They remembered a young person who could be quiet at times, someone who had experienced pain, but also someone who had moments of happiness and connection. Like many teenagers, Laquan existed between childhood and adulthood. He was old enough to understand the difficulties around him, but still young enough to need guidance and protection. He attended high school in Chicago. He was still learning. Still growing. Still trying to understand what kind of person he wanted to become. His life was not a straight path. There were challenges. There were mistakes. There were moments when adults around him worried about his choices. But that reality is true for countless teenagers. Adolescence is a period when people are still developing emotionally and mentally. A teenager is not a finished person. A teenager is someone still becoming. And that idea would later become central to the national conversation surrounding Laquan's death. Many people looking at his story asked an important question. How should society respond to troubled young people? Should they be viewed only through the mistakes they make? Or should people also see the circumstances that shape them? For Laquan, the answer became part of a much larger debate. The public learned about the circumstances of his life only after his death. Many people discovered that before he became a symbol, he had been a young person dealing with personal struggles. They learned about his childhood. They learned about the difficulties he faced. They learned that his story was more complicated than the brief descriptions often used in official documents. A life cannot be reduced to a single night. But tragedy often does exactly that. It takes years of someone's existence and compresses them into one terrible moment. A few seconds. A few actions. A final encounter. That is what happened with Laquan. For many people who heard about the case, the first image they saw was not a teenager. It was a police report. It was an accusation. It was a description of a person allegedly carrying a knife. But his family and those who cared about him knew there was more. They knew there was a young man who had a history. A young man who had experienced hardship. A young man whose life contained more than the circumstances of his death. The tragedy of Laquan McDonald's story is not only that he died. It is that the world had to learn about him after he was gone. Many people never had the opportunity to know him as a living person. They never saw his ordinary moments. They never heard his voice. They never saw the person behind the controversy. They only met him through the events of October 20, 2014. And that is one of the painful realities of many high-profile cases. The victim becomes connected forever to the moment they lost their life. But a person's final moments should never erase their entire existence. Laquan was 17 years old. He had not yet reached adulthood. He had not had the opportunity to experience many of the milestones that define a person's life. Graduation. Career choices. Relationships. Personal growth. The chance to overcome past struggles. Those possibilities disappeared in an instant. For his family, the loss was not about politics. It was not about national debates. It was not about becoming part of history. It was about losing someone they loved. A family member who would no longer walk through their door. A voice they would no longer hear. A future they would never see. The emotional impact of losing a child is difficult to describe. But losing a child under controversial circumstances creates another layer of pain. Grief becomes mixed with questions. Questions that demand answers. What exactly happened? Could it have been prevented? Why did the story told publicly seem different from what the evidence later showed? Those questions would follow Laquan's family for years. They would also become questions asked by an entire city. But before the investigation, before the courtrooms, before the protests, there was a teenager walking through Chicago on an October night. A teenager whose life had already included struggles most people never saw. A teenager who was not simply the person described in official documents. A teenager who had a past. A teenager who had people who cared about him. A teenager who deserved to be remembered as more than the final seconds of his life. Because when history looks back at the case of Laquan McDonald, the most important thing to remember is that this story did not begin with a gunshot. It began with a child. A child who grew up facing challenges. A child who became a teenager trying to survive. A teenager who, like millions of others, was still searching for his place in the world. And on the night of October 20, 2014, that search came to an end on a Chicago street. But the questions about what happened there had only just begun. The night of October 20, 2014, began like many other nights in Chicago. The city was still awake. Traffic continued moving through the streets. Buildings stood illuminated against the darkness. People were finishing their workdays, returning home, meeting friends, and living ordinary lives. But on the southwest side of Chicago, near South Pulaski Road, a series of events was about to unfold that would later become one of the most debated police encounters in modern American history. At the center of that moment was a 17-year-old boy named Laquan McDonald. And within less than a minute, his life would be over. The events began after police received reports about a young man allegedly carrying a knife and damaging vehicles. The exact details of those initial calls would later become part of the controversy surrounding the case. Officers were told there was a person in the area who might be dangerous. When police respond to calls involving possible weapons, the situation is immediately viewed through a different lens. Officers arrive expecting uncertainty. They do not know who they will encounter. They do not know what the person might do. They are trained to look for danger. For the officers arriving that evening, the information they had was limited. They were responding to a report. They were arriving at a scene they did not fully understand. But the person they encountered was Laquan McDonald. A teenager walking through the street. A teenager carrying a small knife. A teenager whose actions during those final moments would later be examined frame by frame. Several police vehicles arrived in the area. The streets were illuminated by headlights and the flashing lights of patrol cars. Officers began moving into position. The situation appeared tense. Laquan was walking near the road. According to later video evidence, he was moving away from the officers. His movements became the focus of intense debate. To some observers, his behavior represented a person who was not following commands. To others, the video showed a teenager who was attempting to move away rather than attack anyone. Those few seconds would become the center of the entire case. Because in police encounters involving deadly force, timing matters. Distance matters. Movement matters. Every second can change the interpretation of what happened. And on this night, those seconds were captured by a camera. A small camera mounted on a police vehicle. A camera that would later become the most important piece of evidence in the investigation. Among the officers responding was Jason Van Dyke. Van Dyke was a Chicago police officer with years of experience. Like many officers, he had responded to countless calls before. He had been trained to make rapid decisions in dangerous situations. But this particular encounter would follow him for the rest of his life. When Van Dyke arrived, he exited his vehicle. The confrontation that followed lasted only moments. According to the prosecution's later argument, Van Dyke used unnecessary and excessive force. The defense argued that he believed he and other officers were facing a threat. The difference between those two interpretations would become the foundation of the courtroom battle years later. But the video showed the physical sequence of events. According to the footage released publicly in 2015, Laquan was walking on the street. He was not running toward officers. He was not physically attacking anyone. He was moving away. Then Van Dyke fired. The first shot struck Laquan. He collapsed onto the pavement. But the shooting did not stop. The officer continued firing. 16 shots were fired in total. The sound of gunfire lasted only a short time. But the consequences would last for years. For Laquan, those seconds were the end of his life. For Chicago, those seconds became the beginning of a painful confrontation with questions about police accountability. The official reports written after the shooting described the situation differently. They stated that Laquan had moved toward officers. They described him as a threat. They suggested that the officer's actions were necessary to protect himself and others. At first, authorities treated the shooting as justified. The public did not have access to the video. They could not see the movements. They could not judge the distance. They could not examine the sequence of events. They had only the information released by officials. And that information created a very different picture. For Laquan's family, this was an unbearable reality. They had lost someone they loved. But they also had to listen as the public discussion focused on whether their son had been dangerous. The person they knew was being described through the lens of the incident that ended his life. Meanwhile, the most important evidence remained unseen. The video existed. Some officials had watched it. Investigators had access to it. But ordinary people did not. That fact would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Because the question was not only what happened on the street. The question was also why the truth remained hidden afterward. Why did the public have to wait? Why was a recording of a fatal encounter not immediately available? Why did the official version remain uncontested for so long? Those questions would grow louder as journalists and activists began examining the case. But on that night, at approximately 9:57 p.m., none of those future debates existed. There was only a dark Chicago street. A teenager. Police officers. And a moment that could never be reversed. After the shooting, officers moved toward Laquan. Emergency medical assistance was called. But the injuries were fatal. The 17-year-old boy was gone. The life of a young person ended on the pavement. A family lost their son. A community lost one of its young residents. And a city would eventually be forced to confront what happened. In the days and weeks after the shooting, the story moved quietly through official channels. The police department investigated. Reports were prepared. Statements were collected. The incident entered the legal system. But outside of those official processes, another story was beginning. A story about transparency. A story about evidence. A story about whether the public had the right to see what happened. The video existed as a silent witness. It held the answers. It showed the movements. It captured the moment. But it remained out of public view. For more than a year, Laquan McDonald's final moments existed behind closed doors. And during that time, the city continued to debate an event that many people had not actually seen. The absence of the footage created uncertainty. It allowed different versions of reality to exist at the same time. For officials, there was an explanation based on reports. For activists and community members, there were unanswered questions. For the family, there was grief mixed with frustration. And for Laquan, there was no chance to tell his own side of the story. The tragedy of October 20, 2014 was not only that a teenager died. It was that the full truth of how he died remained hidden. But hidden evidence does not disappear. A camera had recorded those final moments. And eventually, that camera would force the world to look. For 13 months, the most important witness in the Laquan McDonald case remained silent. It was not a person. It was not someone sitting in a courtroom waiting to testify. It was not a detective, an officer, or an eyewitness standing on the street that night. It was a small camera attached to a police vehicle. A piece of equipment designed to document police activity. A device created to preserve facts. To capture moments that could later answer questions. And on October 20, 2014, that camera recorded everything. The final moments of Laquan McDonald's life. The movement of his body. The position of the officers. The sound of gunfire. The entire encounter. But for more than a year, the public could not see it. The footage existed somewhere inside the system. Officials knew it existed. Investigators knew it existed. But the people demanding answers were left waiting. During that time, the official version of events dominated public understanding. The police reports described a dangerous confrontation. They described an officer responding to a threat. They described a situation where deadly force was presented as necessary. Without the video, many people had no way to challenge that account. The public was being asked to trust the institutions involved in the investigation. But for many residents in Chicago, trust was already fragile. The history between law enforcement and certain communities had created years of tension. Questions about police conduct were not new. Concerns about transparency were not new. And the decision to keep the video private only increased suspicion. For Laquan's family, the waiting was painful. They knew their son was dead. They knew police had shot him. But they did not have the complete picture of what happened in those final seconds. They were forced to hear descriptions of their son's death from official sources while the evidence that could confirm or challenge those descriptions remained unavailable. A year passed. Then another month. Then another. The video remained hidden. But outside the walls of government offices, pressure continued to grow. Journalists began asking difficult questions. Community activists demanded transparency. People wanted to know why a case involving a teenager killed by police did not have its most important piece of evidence available to the public. Among those seeking answers was journalist Jamie Calvin. Calvin began investigating the case and examining the circumstances surrounding Laquan's death. His work focused attention on the contradictions between what authorities had said and what questions remained unanswered. The issue was no longer only about the shooting itself. It was also about access to information. About whether public institutions could decide when citizens were allowed to see evidence involving the use of deadly force. The legal battle over the video became a fight over transparency. Under freedom of information laws, journalists and members of the public argued that the footage should be released. The city resisted. Officials argued against immediate disclosure. But eventually, the pressure reached the courts. A judge ordered that the video must be made public. The decision changed everything. On November 24, 2015, the city of Chicago released the footage. For the first time, the public could see what happened on South Pulaski Road. The video was only a few minutes long, but its impact was enormous. Millions of people watched it. Many watched with disbelief, because the images appeared dramatically different from the descriptions that had been given after the shooting. The footage did not show the dramatic confrontation many people expected. It did not show Laquan charging toward officers. It did not show the immediate attack described in early reports. Instead, viewers saw a teenager walking on the street. They saw him moving away from the officers. They saw the distance between him and Jason Van Dyke. Then they saw the gunfire begin. The release of the video transformed the entire case overnight. The conversation changed. Before the footage became public, people debated an event they had never witnessed. After the footage was released, everyone could examine the same images. The video became the center of every discussion. News broadcasts replayed it. Experts analyzed it. Community members watched it. Lawyers studied every second. Every movement became important. Every decision became questioned. The footage showed that after the first shots, Laquan fell to the ground. Yet the shooting continued. The image of a teenager lying on the pavement while additional shots were fired became the moment that shocked many viewers. For many people, it was difficult to understand how the encounter escalated so quickly. The video raised questions that could no longer be ignored. Why did the officer fire so many times? Why did the shooting continue after Laquan was already down? Why did the initial reports appear different from what the footage showed? The release of the video did not simply provide evidence. It changed the entire public understanding of the case. A story that had existed behind official statements suddenly became a story everyone could see. And with visibility came anger. The streets of Chicago filled with protesters. People gathered demanding justice and accountability. They carried signs with Laquan's name. They marched through downtown areas. They stood outside government buildings. Their message was clear. They wanted answers. They wanted responsibility. They wanted the truth. For many protesters, the video represented something larger than one shooting. It represented years of frustration over police accountability. It represented fears that without public pressure, cases involving police officers might not receive the same scrutiny as other cases. The footage also created political consequences. City leaders faced intense criticism. Questions were directed toward the police department. People asked why the video had remained private for so long. Why had the public narrative been allowed to develop without the evidence being available? The case became a national story. People across the United States watched the footage and debated the issues surrounding it. The name Laquan McDonald became connected to larger discussions about policing, race, government transparency, and justice. But behind the national debate was still a family mourning a 17-year-old boy. The release of the video could provide answers, but it could not bring Laquan back. It could reveal what happened, but it could not undo what happened. For those who loved him, the video was both painful and important. It showed the truth of his final moments. But it also forced them to watch those moments repeatedly as the world analyzed their son's death. The same footage that became evidence in court also became a permanent public record of a family's loss. As investigators examined the video, new questions emerged. The investigation expanded. The focus shifted from whether the shooting was justified to whether the official accounts had been accurate. The difference between the written reports and the video became impossible to ignore. The case was no longer only about one officer's actions. It became about the system surrounding those actions. Who knew what? Who saw the video? Who approved the original statements? Who was responsible for the delay? These questions would lead investigators deeper into the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Because sometimes the most important evidence does not only reveal what happened during a crime. Sometimes it reveals what happened afterward. And in the case of Laquan McDonald, the discovery was not simply finding evidence. The evidence had existed all along. The real discovery was finally allowing the world to see it. When the video of Laquan McDonald's final moments was released to the public, the case entered a completely different phase. For more than a year, investigators, officials, and attorneys had been dealing with a shooting that many ordinary people had never seen. But once the footage became public, there was no longer a debate based only on reports and statements. There were images. There was a timeline. There was a recording that could be examined again and again. And that recording raised new questions. The investigation was no longer focused only on what happened in those few seconds on South Pulaski Road. It expanded into a much larger examination of what happened before and after the shooting. What did officers know? What did they see? Were the official reports accurate? Was information withheld from the public? And why did it take 13 months for the video to become available? The release of the footage created a powerful contradiction. The initial police narrative described a dangerous encounter. It suggested that Laquan McDonald represented an immediate threat. But the video appeared to show a different sequence. The teenager was moving away. The officer was at a distance. The shooting happened quickly. And after Laquan fell to the ground, the gunfire continued. For investigators, the central issue became whether the use of deadly force was legally justified. For prosecutors, the question was whether Jason Van Dyke's actions crossed the line from a response to danger into an unlawful use of force. For the defense, the question was whether Van Dyke reasonably believed he was facing a threat. The interpretation of those few seconds would become the foundation of a historic trial. But before the courtroom battle began, investigators had to examine everything surrounding the shooting. That meant reviewing police reports, interviewing officers, examining physical evidence, analyzing video footage, and comparing the written accounts with what the camera actually captured. One of the most significant issues was the difference between the reports and the video. The reports described Laquan moving toward officers. The footage became the central evidence challenging that description. The gap between those two versions created intense public suspicion. Many people wondered how such a major difference could exist. How could a report describe an aggressive movement that did not appear visible on the recording? The investigation became not only about the shooting, but about credibility. A police report is supposed to create a factual record. It is supposed to document what happened. But when that record appears inconsistent with available evidence, questions naturally follow. The controversy grew even larger because the delay in releasing the video created the impression that officials were protecting the department rather than serving the public. For many residents, the secrecy became almost as important as the shooting itself. They questioned whether the truth would have emerged without pressure from journalists, activists, and the courts. The investigation also examined the actions of other officers who were present. The shooting involved more than one officer responding to the scene. Other officers were nearby. They witnessed events. They provided information afterward. Their statements became part of the larger investigation into whether the official account had been accurate. The focus expanded beyond the individual officer who fired the shots. It became a question about the entire system. A system responsible for investigating itself. A system where officers were asked to report on the actions of other officers. A system where public confidence depended on transparency. During this period, another controversy emerged involving surveillance footage from a nearby Burger King restaurant. The restaurant's security cameras had captured part of the area around the incident. Investigators were interested in the footage because additional angles could potentially provide more information. But later reports revealed that approximately 86 minutes of video from the restaurant's surveillance system were missing. The disappearance of that footage created additional suspicion. Some people questioned whether evidence had been mishandled or intentionally removed. The issue became another symbol of the larger distrust surrounding the case. However, despite the controversy, no criminal charges were ultimately brought regarding the missing footage. Still, the incident contributed to the perception that important information had repeatedly been unavailable when the public needed answers. As investigators continued their work, the legal pressure against Jason Van Dyke increased. The release of the video had changed public opinion dramatically. The image of the shooting became impossible to separate from the legal arguments. The prosecution argued that the footage showed unnecessary force. They argued that Laquan was not presenting the immediate danger described by the defense. They focused on the number of shots fired. They focused on the continued shooting after Laquan had fallen. They argued that the officer's actions went beyond what was necessary under the circumstances. The defense presented a different interpretation. They argued that Van Dyke believed he was responding to a dangerous situation. They argued that police officers must make decisions quickly in uncertain circumstances. They emphasized that officers often have to react based on what they perceive in the moment, not what later analysis reveals. At the center of the investigation was a difficult question that appears in many police use of force cases. What did the officer reasonably believe at that exact moment? Not afterward. Not after watching the video. Not after public debate. But during those few seconds when the decision was made. That question would eventually be answered by a jury. But before that happened, the investigation continued to uncover the broader consequences of the case. The city of Chicago faced enormous criticism. Political leaders were questioned. The police department faced demands for reform. Community members argued that the case represented a deeper problem, not an isolated event. For many people, Laquan McDonald's death represented years of frustration. They saw the delayed release of the video as evidence of a system that lacked transparency. They believed that without outside pressure, the public might never have seen the footage. The investigation became a symbol of a larger struggle between government authority and public accountability. It showed how powerful evidence can be when citizens are able to access it. It demonstrated how a single recording can challenge official explanations. And it raised difficult questions about who controls the truth when institutions control the evidence. As the investigation moved forward, the legal consequences became clearer. Jason Van Dyke would eventually face criminal charges. The officer who had once been described as responding to a threat would now stand before a court and answer for his actions. But the case would not end there. Because the investigation had uncovered something much larger than a single shooting. It had revealed a battle over trust. A battle over transparency. A battle over whether justice can exist without accountability. And at the center of that battle remained the same teenager whose name had become known around the world. Laquan McDonald. A 17-year-old whose final moments were captured by a camera. A teenager whose death forced a city to confront uncomfortable questions. And a case that would eventually lead to a courtroom where 12 jurors would have to decide one thing. Was this a tragic mistake made in a moment of fear? Or was it a crime hidden behind an official story that could no longer survive once the video was seen? For more than a year, the truth about Laquan McDonald's death existed behind closed doors. The evidence was there. The video was there. The questions were there. But the answers remained out of reach for the public. Then, in November 2015, everything changed. The release of the dashcam footage did not simply add another piece of information to the case. It transformed the entire investigation. The video became the turning point. The moment when a case that had moved quietly through official channels suddenly became impossible to ignore. Before the footage was released, the public had been asked to accept a version of events based largely on official statements. Those statements described a dangerous encounter. They described a teenager who was allegedly moving toward police officers with a knife. They described an officer reacting to a threat. But when people finally saw the footage, they witnessed something that appeared very different. The camera did not show a dramatic attack. It did not show a teenager charging toward officers. It showed movement. Distance. A brief encounter. Then gunfire. The impact of those images was immediate. Across Chicago, people watched the footage and struggled to understand what they were seeing. Many viewers focused on the same details. Laquan was walking. He appeared to be moving away. The officer approached. The gun was fired. Then the shooting continued after Laquan fell. For many people, the video answered one question while creating many others. The footage showed what happened physically. But it raised deeper questions about judgment, accountability, and the responsibility of those who controlled the information afterward. The public reaction was enormous. Chicago experienced a wave of protests. People gathered in streets, outside government buildings, and near locations connected to the case. They carried signs bearing Laquan's name. They demanded justice. They demanded answers. The protests were not only about one teenager. For many participants, Laquan's death represented years of frustration with police accountability. They believed the delayed release of the video reflected a larger problem. A problem where communities often had to fight for information about incidents involving law enforcement. A problem where official explanations were sometimes accepted before the public had access to the evidence. The video changed the balance of power. Before its release, the authorities controlled the narrative. After its release, the public had the ability to examine the evidence themselves. The images became a challenge to the original explanation. The legal system now had to respond. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office, led at the time by Anita Alvarez, faced increasing pressure to take action. The question was no longer whether people were angry. The question was what legal consequences would follow. On November 24, 2015, the same day the video became public, Jason Van Dyke was charged with first-degree murder. The announcement marked a historic moment. For the first time in decades, a Chicago police officer faced murder charges for an on-duty shooting. The case moved from public controversy into a criminal courtroom. But the decision did not end the debate. Instead, it intensified it. Many people questioned why charges came only after the video was released. Why had the case moved slowly before public pressure increased? Why had the officer not faced charges earlier? Supporters of the prosecution argued that the video provided critical evidence and that legal decisions required careful review. Critics argued that without the pressure created by journalists, activists, and the public, accountability might never have arrived. The timing itself became part of the controversy. The case had become a symbol of how evidence, public attention, and political pressure can influence the pursuit of justice. As the investigation continued, prosecutors examined every detail of the encounter. They focused on the number of shots fired. They focused on the fact that Laquan was struck multiple times. They focused on the moment after he fell. The prosecution's argument was that the video showed a use of force that was not necessary to stop an immediate threat. They argued that Van Dyke had enough distance and time to evaluate the situation differently. The defense prepared a different argument. They maintained that Van Dyke had to make a decision in a rapidly changing situation. They argued that police officers face dangerous circumstances where hesitation can have serious consequences. They emphasized the difficulty of judging an officer's actions after the fact. The trial would eventually become a battle between two interpretations of the same footage. One side saw a teenager who was walking away in a shooting that could have been avoided. The other side saw an officer responding to a situation he believed was dangerous. The breakthrough in the case was not only that charges were filed. It was that the evidence had forced the legal system to confront the questions that had surrounded the shooting from the beginning. The video had removed uncertainty. It had eliminated the possibility that the case could be discussed only through reports and statements. Everyone had seen the same footage. Everyone had to respond to the same images. But the consequences extended beyond Jason Van Dyke. The controversy reached the highest levels of Chicago government. The police department faced intense criticism. The city's leadership faced questions about transparency and accountability. Chicago Police Superintendent Gary McCarthy eventually lost his position amid the growing controversy. Mayor Rahm Emanuel faced criticism over the handling of the case and the decision-making process surrounding the video's release. The case became a defining moment in Chicago's political landscape. But for the McDonald family, politics was secondary. No public debate could change the reality that their 17-year-old son was gone. No court decision could erase the pain of losing him. No protest could return the future that had been taken away. For them, justice meant more than headlines. It meant recognition. It meant acknowledgement of what happened. It meant that Laquan's life and death would not disappear into a forgotten police report. The breakthrough came because the video survived. Because people continued asking questions. Because journalists investigated. Because legal challenges forced disclosure. Because the evidence could no longer remain hidden. The case demonstrated the power of recorded evidence in the modern era. A camera that had been placed inside a police vehicle for documentation became the central witness in a historic criminal case. It showed how technology could challenge official narratives. It showed how transparency could change the direction of an investigation. And it showed how one piece of evidence could transform a local incident into a national conversation. But the most important battle was still ahead. The courtroom. That was where 12 jurors would eventually have to watch the footage, examine the evidence, hear the arguments, and decide the fate of Jason Van Dyke. The question that had haunted Chicago since October 20, 2014 would finally be placed before a jury. What exactly happened in those final seconds? And was the officer's decision to fire 16 times a justified act of protection? Or a criminal act against a teenager who could no longer speak for himself? The courtroom was quiet when the case of Jason Van Dyke finally reached trial. For years, the name Laquan McDonald had been connected to one of the most controversial police shootings in American history. The video had been watched by millions. The protests had filled Chicago's streets. The political consequences had spread throughout the city. But inside the courtroom, away from the cameras and public demonstrations, the case came down to something much more focused. Evidence. Testimony. And the judgment of 12 people sitting in the jury box. Their task was not to decide whether the shooting had caused anger. It was not to decide whether the city had lost trust in its institutions. Their task was to answer a specific legal question. Did Jason Van Dyke commit a crime when he fired his weapon at Laquan McDonald? The trial began in 2018, nearly 4 years after the shooting. By then, the case had become a national symbol. But inside the courtroom, the prosecution and defense returned to the same moment that had started everything. The night of October 20, 2014. The street. The officers. The teenager. The gunshots. The video. The prosecution built its case around the argument that the shooting was unnecessary and excessive. They argued that the footage clearly showed Laquan was not presenting an immediate deadly threat. They pointed to the distance between Laquan and Van Dyke. They pointed to Laquan's movement. They pointed to the fact that the shooting continued after he had fallen to the ground. For prosecutors, the video was the central piece of evidence. It showed what happened without relying on memory, without interpretation, without the passage of time changing people's recollections. The jury could see the same images that had changed public understanding of the case. The prosecution argued that the officers' actions went beyond what could be considered a reasonable response. They described the shooting as unnecessary and unjustified. They argued that a police officer has the authority to use deadly force only when facing a serious and immediate threat. According to the prosecution, that threat did not exist in the moments when Van Dyke fired. The defense presented a different perspective. They argued that Van Dyke was a police officer responding to a dangerous situation. They emphasized that officers must make decisions quickly, sometimes under extreme pressure. They argued that the legal standard should consider what the officer believed at the moment, not what people later concluded after watching a video repeatedly. The defense focused on the fact that Laquan had a knife. They argued that the presence of a weapon created a dangerous situation. They suggested that Van Dyke had only seconds to react and that hesitation could have placed lives at risk. The courtroom became a place where two very different interpretations of the same event collided. One side focused on the teenager walking away. The other focused on the uncertainty officers faced during confrontations. One side saw unnecessary violence. The other saw a split-second decision made in fear. The jury watched the video. They listened to testimony. They examined the evidence. They heard experts discuss police procedures, use of force, and the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Every detail mattered. The angle of the camera. The timing of the shots. The movements before and after the gunfire. The number of bullets fired. The position of Laquan's body. The words spoken by witnesses. The credibility of statements. The entire case depended on understanding those final moments. One of the most significant aspects of the trial was the video itself. Unlike many cases involving police shootings, the jury was not forced to rely only on conflicting descriptions. They had a recording. A visual timeline. A document that could not forget. The footage became the silent witness that had existed since the night of the shooting. During the trial, the jury also heard about the aftermath of the incident. They learned about the public controversy. They learned about the delayed release of the video. They learned about the investigation and the questions surrounding the original reports. But ultimately, their decision had to focus on the actions of Jason Van Dyke. Not the politics. Not the protests. Not the public reaction. Only the evidence. After weeks of testimony, the jury began deliberations. For many people watching the case, this was the moment they had been waiting for. Years had passed since Laquan McDonald was killed. His name had become part of national conversations. But now, the final decision rested with ordinary citizens. They had to determine whether the prosecution had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. On October 5, 2018, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom waited. Jason Van Dyke stood before the judge. The verdict was announced. He was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was also found guilty of 16 counts of aggravated battery with a firearm, 1 count for each shot fired at Laquan McDonald. The decision was historic. Jason Van Dyke became the first Chicago police officer in decades to be convicted of murder for an on-duty shooting. The reaction was immediate. For supporters of accountability, the verdict represented a significant moment. They believed it showed that police officers could be held responsible when they used excessive force. For others, the verdict raised concerns about the challenges officers face when making decisions in dangerous situations. But regardless of perspective, the verdict marked a turning point. The courtroom had delivered its answer. The jury had watched the evidence. They had considered the arguments. And they concluded that Van Dyke's actions were criminal. Months later, in January 2019, Jason Van Dyke was sentenced to prison. The judge sentenced him to 6 years and 9 months. He was also required to serve parole after his release. The sentence became another source of debate. Some believed it was too lenient considering the circumstances and the number of shots fired. Others argued that the conviction itself was the most important outcome. For Laquan's family, no sentence could restore what had been lost. A prison term could not bring back a 17-year-old son. It could not erase years of grief. It could not return the future that disappeared on that October night. Justice in cases like this is often complicated. A verdict can answer legal questions. But it cannot repair every emotional wound. It cannot undo the pain carried by families. It cannot erase the memory of what happened. The trial of Jason Van Dyke became more than a legal proceeding. It became a moment of national reflection. It forced conversations about police training, about accountability, about transparency, about how communities and law enforcement interact. The case demonstrated the importance of evidence. Without the video, the courtroom battle might have looked very different. Without the recording, the public may never have known exactly what happened. The camera inside that police vehicle became the most important witness. It preserved a moment that could not be rewritten. It challenged an official account. And it allowed a jury to see the events for themselves. But even after the verdict, the story of Laquan McDonald did not end. Because the consequences of his death continued beyond the courtroom. The case changed Chicago. It influenced policy. It changed public discussions. It became part of a larger national conversation about justice and accountability. And for many people, the biggest lesson was not only about one officer or one shooting. It was about the importance of truth. Because sometimes justice begins with a simple act. Allowing people to see what really happened, the verdict against Jason Van Dyke brought a legal conclusion to one chapter of the Laquan McDonald case. But it did not end the conversation. Because the death of a 17-year-old boy had created questions that could not be answered by a single conviction. A jury had delivered a decision. A judge had handed down a sentence. But the larger issues surrounding Laquan's death continued to exist. Questions about trust. Questions about transparency. Questions about the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. The case had begun on a dark street in Chicago. But its consequences reached far beyond that location. They reached City Hall. They reached police departments across America. They reached communities where people had long debated how power should be used and how accountability should be maintained. For Chicago, the aftermath of the case became a period of reflection and change. The city had been forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. A young man had been killed. A video had existed. The public had not seen it for more than a year. And the difference between the official narrative and the images captured on camera had created a crisis of confidence. For many residents, especially those in communities that had experienced difficult relationships with police, the case confirmed fears that accountability was not automatic. They believed that without public pressure, the truth might have remained hidden. They believed that the system had protected itself before protecting the public's right to know. The controversy surrounding the delayed release of the video became one of the defining aspects of the case. The footage had not been lost. It had not been destroyed. It existed from the beginning. Yet ordinary citizens could not access it until a legal battle forced its release. That reality changed how many people viewed government transparency. It raised a fundamental question. When a government agency investigates itself, who ensures that the public receives the truth. The case became a powerful example of why independent oversight matters. Because evidence alone does not always create accountability. Evidence must also be accessible. It must be examined. It must be allowed to challenge official explanations when necessary. The impact of the Laquan McDonald case was felt throughout the Chicago Police Department. The department faced intense criticism over its policies, its culture, and its approach to investigations involving officers. Public officials faced demands for reform. The city faced pressure to rebuild trust with residents who felt ignored. Chicago Police Superintendent Gary McCarthy was removed from his position in the aftermath of the controversy. The decision reflected the political consequences created by the case and the growing criticism of how city leadership handled the situation. But removing one official did not solve the deeper issues. The problems raised by the case were larger than any single person. They involved systems, policies, training, oversight. The way institutions respond when their own members are accused of wrongdoing. The case also influenced conversations about police body cameras and video evidence. Across the United States, many communities began paying closer attention to how encounters between police and civilians were documented. The logic was simple. If a camera can preserve the truth of a critical moment, then that recording can become essential to accountability. The Laquan McDonald case demonstrated the power of visual evidence. A written report can be questioned. A witness can forget details. Memories can change. But video creates a record. It captures movement. It captures timing. It captures moments that might otherwise be disputed forever. However, the case also showed that technology alone is not enough. A camera does not automatically create justice. A recording must still be reviewed. It must still be released when appropriate. It must still be interpreted through a fair legal process. The existence of video does not remove the need for human judgment. Instead, it creates a responsibility to use evidence honestly. For Laquan's family, the aftermath was far more personal than political discussions. Long after the cameras disappeared from the courthouse and the protests ended, they still lived with the absence of their son. A conviction could acknowledge what happened. It could establish legal responsibility. But it could never restore the life that was lost. There would be no graduation. No future achievements. No chance to see who Laquan might have become. That was the reality behind every debate surrounding the case. A teenager was gone. A family had lost someone they loved. And no public discussion could change that. Over time, Laquan McDonald became remembered not only because of how he died, but because of what his case revealed. His name became connected to conversations about police accountability throughout the United States. His story became part of a larger movement examining the use of force by law enforcement. His death became a reminder of the importance of transparency. But behind the symbol was still a person. A 17-year-old boy. A young person whose life contained more than one tragic night. A teenager who had experienced struggles but also had dreams, relationships, and possibilities. The challenge after cases like this is remembering both realities. Remembering the importance of accountability while also remembering the humanity of the person at the center. Because public debates can sometimes transform individuals into symbols. They can become examples. They can become arguments. But before all of that, there were people. Laquan McDonald was a person. His life mattered before the shooting. His story existed before the video. His identity was more than the final moments captured by a police camera. The case also changed how many people thought about evidence and truth. It showed that sometimes the most important information is not hidden because it does not exist. Sometimes it is hidden because releasing it changes everything. The Laquan McDonald video changed the conversation because it removed uncertainty. It forced officials, investigators, and the public to confront the same images. It showed the power of journalism, legal challenges, and public pressure. It demonstrated that accountability often requires persistence. The aftermath of the case continues to influence discussions about policing today. Whenever questions arise about officer-involved shootings, the case remains part of the conversation. Whenever people debate the role of cameras and transparency, Laquan McDonald's name is remembered. Whenever communities ask whether institutions can be trusted to investigate themselves, this case remains an example. But perhaps the most important lesson from the aftermath is that justice is not only about what happens in court. Justice also involves memory. It involves acknowledging what happened. It involves recognizing the people affected. It involves learning from tragedy so that future tragedies can be prevented. The street where Laquan McDonald died became a place connected forever to a painful moment. But the story that came from that street was much larger. It was a story about evidence. A story about truth. A story about a city forced to look at itself. And a story about how one teenager's final moments changed the way an entire nation discussed accountability. Because sometimes history does not change because of powerful people. Sometimes history changes because a camera captured something that could no longer be ignored. Years after the gunshots on South Pulaski Road faded into history, the name Laquan McDonald continued to appear whenever America discussed police accountability, transparency, and the difficult relationship between communities and law enforcement. His name became connected to protests, courtrooms, political debates, and national conversations. But behind every discussion, behind every headline, behind every argument about policy and reform, there remained one simple truth. Before Laquan McDonald became a symbol, he was a person. He was a teenager. A 17-year-old boy whose life was filled with experiences that most of the world would never know. His story did not begin with the sound of gunfire. It began years earlier. It began with childhood. With challenges. With moments of uncertainty. With a young person trying to find his way through circumstances that were often beyond his control. The tragedy of Laquan's death was not only that a life ended too soon. It was that the world learned about him primarily through the circumstances of his death. Many people first encountered his name through a police report. They first saw him connected to a controversial encounter. They first heard arguments about what happened on that street. But a person's life cannot be measured only by their final moments. Every individual carries a history that exists before tragedy arrives. Laquan had hopes. He had struggles. He had relationships. He had a future that, like every young person's future, was still unfinished. That unfinished story became one of the most painful parts of the case. Because when a young person dies, people are not only mourning who they were. They are also mourning who they could have become. The dreams that would never happen. The experiences they would never have. The person they might have grown into. For Laquan's family, the years after his death were filled with that absence. The absence of ordinary moments. The absence of conversations. The absence of watching him grow older. The legal process could determine responsibility. But it could not restore what had been taken away. That distinction is important. A conviction can provide accountability. A verdict can recognize wrongdoing. But justice does not always mean healing. Sometimes justice simply means acknowledging the truth. And for many people, the truth of the Laquan McDonald case was inseparable from the video. The footage became more than evidence. It became a symbol. A symbol of why transparency matters. A symbol of why independent investigations matter. A symbol of why the public must have confidence that powerful institutions can be held accountable. The video changed the direction of the case because it removed the ability to rely only on competing stories. There were no longer just two different versions of the event. There was a recording. A visual record. A moment preserved forever. That recording became a reminder that technology can reveal truths that might otherwise remain hidden. But it also became a reminder that evidence only has power when people are willing to confront it. A camera can record. But people must decide whether to watch. Institutions must decide whether to release. Courts must decide how to interpret. Society must decide what lessons to learn. The Laquan McDonald case became part of a larger national movement examining police use of force. Across the United States, communities debated questions that had existed for decades. How should officers respond in dangerous situations? How can communities trust law enforcement? Who investigates when police officers are accused of wrongdoing? How can accountability exist within institutions designed to protect society? These questions did not have simple answers. They involved complicated realities. Police officers face dangerous situations. Communities deserve protection. Victims deserve justice. And public institutions must maintain trust. The case forced people to confront the difficulty of balancing those responsibilities. It also changed conversations about police video evidence. Before the widespread use of body cameras and dashboard cameras, many encounters between police and civilians depended heavily on written reports and eyewitness accounts. But as video technology became more common, expectations changed. People began asking, if a camera recorded what happened, why should the public not see it? The Laquan McDonald case became one of the most significant examples of how video evidence can influence public understanding and legal outcomes. The footage did not merely support an argument. It transformed the entire discussion. It showed how a single recording could challenge official statements and force institutions to respond. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the case is not the video itself. It is the reminder that accountability often depends on people willing to demand answers. Journalists who continued asking questions. Lawyers who fought for information. Community members who refused to accept silence. Citizens who wanted transparency. Without those efforts, the video may have remained unseen. The story may have been remembered very differently. The case demonstrated the importance of a free press and public oversight. It showed that institutions must be questioned when trust is at stake. It showed that justice is not always automatic. Sometimes it requires persistence. Sometimes it requires uncomfortable conversations. Sometimes it requires looking directly at painful evidence. For Chicago, the aftermath of the case became a turning point. The city faced pressure to examine its policing practices. Officials faced demands for reform. Residents demanded a stronger relationship between police and the communities they served. The case became part of Chicago's ongoing effort to address issues of trust and accountability. But even as policies changed and debates continued, the most important part of the story remained the person at the center. Laquan McDonald. A teenager whose life ended far too early. A young person whose story became known around the world. A name that became associated with justice and accountability. But also a name belonging to a human being who had a life before the tragedy. Remembering that humanity matters. Because when people become symbols, there is a danger that the individual disappears. The person becomes an argument. A statistic. A political talking point. But Laquan was never just a case. He was someone's son. Someone's family member. Someone's friend. Someone who once walked through Chicago streets not knowing that his name would one day become known across the country. The final lesson of the Laquan McDonald case is not only about a police shooting. It is about the importance of truth. It is about what happens when evidence challenges authority. It is about why transparency matters. It is about how societies respond when something painful is revealed. Because the most difficult moments in history often come when people are forced to look at something they would rather avoid. The video from that October night forced Chicago to look. It forced officials to answer questions. It forced the justice system to examine the evidence. It forced the country to discuss uncomfortable realities. And it ensured that Laquan McDonald's story would not disappear. A teenager's final moments became a national conversation. A silent camera became a voice. A hidden recording became evidence. And a young man who lost his life became part of a larger demand for truth. The story of Laquan McDonald remains a reminder that accountability begins with honesty. Because without truth, there can be no justice. Without transparency, there can be no trust. And without remembering the humanity behind the headlines, there can be no real understanding of what was lost. The conviction of Jason Van Dyke brought a sense of legal closure to the Laquan McDonald case. After years of investigation, public debate, and courtroom arguments, a jury had finally delivered its decision. The officer who fired 16 shots at a 17-year-old teenager had been found guilty. For many people who had demanded accountability, the verdict represented an important moment. It showed that a police officer could be held criminally responsible. It showed that a badge did not place someone beyond the reach of the law. It showed that evidence, when brought into the light, could change the course of history. But even after the verdict, many questions remained. Because the case had never been only about one officer. It had also been about the system surrounding that officer. The decisions made after the shooting. The reports that were written. The video that was withheld. The officials who knew what happened. And the long silence before the public was allowed to see the truth. The conviction answered one question. But it left many others unresolved. On the night Laquan McDonald died, a police vehicle camera recorded the encounter. That video became the central piece of evidence. But for 13 months, it remained unavailable to the public. That delay became one of the most controversial parts of the entire case. Many people asked why. Why did the city wait so long? Why was the public narrative shaped before the evidence was released? Why did it require legal action and public pressure before the footage became accessible? These questions created a deeper discussion about transparency in government. A democratic society depends on public trust. People must believe that institutions act honestly. They must believe that when something goes wrong, the truth will eventually emerge. But the handling of the Laquan McDonald video damaged that trust for many residents. For some people in Chicago, the delay confirmed long-standing fears. They believed powerful institutions often protected themselves before admitting mistakes. They believed ordinary citizens had to fight harder to receive information that should have been available from the beginning. The video became a symbol not only of what happened on the street, but of what happened afterward. The case showed that sometimes the struggle for justice does not end when an incident occurs. Sometimes the struggle begins with discovering what actually happened. The controversy surrounding the video also raised questions about the role of prosecutors and city officials. Why were charges filed when they were? Why did the criminal investigation move at the pace it did? Could action have happened sooner? These questions became part of the public debate. Supporters of the officials involved argued that complex investigations require time. They argued that prosecutors must carefully review evidence before bringing criminal charges. They argued that legal decisions should not be based on public emotion alone. Critics responded that the delay itself had consequences. They argued that every day without accountability increased distrust. They questioned whether justice was truly possible if the public had to demand evidence before the system acted. The disagreement reflected a larger challenge faced by many communities. How can a system balance careful investigation with the need for immediate transparency? How can officials maintain fairness while also recognizing the public's right to know? The Laquan McDonald case became one of the clearest examples of that difficult balance. Another major issue that remained controversial was the involvement of other officers at the scene. The investigation examined whether additional officers had provided inaccurate information or helped create a false narrative after the shooting. 3 officers were eventually charged with obstruction of justice and misconduct related to the investigation. The allegations focused on claims that they misrepresented aspects of the encounter. The prosecution argued that their actions contributed to a misleading account of what happened. The defense argued that the officers had acted within the normal process of reporting an incident and that their statements were not criminal. In 2019, those officers were acquitted. The verdict created another wave of discussion. For some people, the acquittal was evidence that proving misconduct beyond a reasonable doubt remained difficult. For others, it raised questions about whether the entire system was capable of holding multiple individuals accountable. The outcome demonstrated that even when a case receives enormous public attention, different legal questions can lead to different results. The criminal justice system does not operate on public opinion. It operates on evidence and legal standards. But public trust is influenced by more than courtroom verdicts. It is influenced by how people perceive the entire process. The missing Burger King surveillance footage added another layer of controversy. The restaurant near the scene had security cameras that potentially captured additional views of the area. Investigators were interested in that footage. But later, it was discovered that a significant portion of the recording was missing. The disappearance of approximately 86 minutes of footage created suspicion and speculation. People questioned how important evidence could disappear during such a high-profile investigation. Although the issue did not result in criminal charges related to destruction of evidence, the controversy contributed to the belief among many residents that the handling of information had been deeply flawed. For many observers, the pattern was troubling. First, the shooting occurred. Then, the official explanation was questioned. Then, the video remained hidden. Then, additional concerns emerged about missing surveillance footage. Each event added another layer of distrust. The case became about more than a single encounter. It became about confidence in institutions. The Laquan McDonald case forced Chicago to confront a difficult reality. Trust, once damaged, is not easily repaired. A conviction can hold one person responsible. But rebuilding faith in an entire system requires much more. It requires transparency. It requires consistent accountability. It requires communities believing that their concerns are heard before a crisis occurs. The aftermath also changed the way many people viewed police technology. The case demonstrated the importance of cameras as tools for accountability. But it also revealed a difficult truth. A camera only matters if the recording is preserved, reviewed honestly, and made available when appropriate. Technology cannot replace integrity. A video cannot create justice by itself. People must decide what to do with the truth that technology reveals. The Laquan McDonald case became a lesson in that responsibility. It showed that evidence can challenge powerful institutions. It showed that public attention can force change. But it also showed how much damage can occur when transparency comes too late. For Laquan's family, the unanswered questions were not academic. They were personal. Every unanswered question represented another reminder of the night they lost their son. Every debate about policy was connected to a real human loss. Every discussion about accountability returned to one teenager who never had the chance to speak for himself. And perhaps that is why the case continues to be remembered. Not because every question has been answered, but because some questions remain important precisely because they are difficult. Questions about power. Questions about responsibility. Questions about who controls information. Questions about how society responds when the truth is uncomfortable. The story of Laquan McDonald did not end with a guilty verdict. The verdict was one chapter. The larger story continued. Because the most significant impact of the case was not only what happened to one officer. It was what happened to an entire city after it was forced to confront what had been hidden. And once the public had seen the video, there was no way to return to the silence that came before. The story of Laquan McDonald began on one street in Chicago. It involved one teenager, one police officer, one encounter that lasted less than a minute. But the consequences of those seconds traveled far beyond the city limits. After the release of the dashcam video, the case became part of a much larger national conversation about policing, accountability, and the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. For many Americans, the video represented something powerful. It was not simply a recording of a tragic event. It was a reminder of the importance of evidence. A reminder that facts must be visible. A reminder that accountability often begins when people are able to see what happened for themselves. Before the video was released, the public discussion surrounding Laquan's death depended largely on official statements. After the video was released, millions of people could examine the event directly. That changed everything. The images removed the distance between the public and the incident. People were no longer hearing only about what happened. They were seeing it. And what they saw forced a national conversation. Across America, communities were already debating issues involving police use of force. The names of other victims had become part of public discussions about law enforcement and accountability. But the Laquan McDonald case added a new dimension. It demonstrated the influence of recorded evidence. It showed how a single piece of video could challenge official explanations and reshape public understanding. The case became a defining example of why transparency matters. The image of the police vehicle camera became symbolic. A small device designed to record routine police activity had captured a moment that would eventually influence national debates. It became a reminder that technology can reveal truths that might otherwise remain disputed. But the case also showed that technology alone is not enough. A camera cannot speak unless people are willing to listen. A recording cannot create change unless institutions respond. Evidence must still pass through human decisions. Someone must preserve it. Someone must release it. Someone must examine it. Someone must act. The Laquan McDonald case became an example of both the power and limitations of modern technology. The video existed from the beginning. Yet the public waited more than a year to see it. That delay became one of the most important lessons of the case. Transparency is not only about having information. It is about making information available when it matters. Across the country, discussions about police body cameras became more intense. Many communities looked at the case and asked whether similar situations could happen without video evidence. They questioned how many incidents might remain unclear because there was no recording. They debated whether cameras could improve trust between police officers and civilians. The argument was simple. When a serious encounter occurs, an objective record can help reveal the truth. But the case also showed that cameras are not a complete solution. A recording can document an event. It cannot automatically repair relationships. It cannot eliminate bias. It cannot guarantee justice. Those things require deeper changes. The national conversation after Laquan's death focused on several major issues. One was police training. Many people questioned how officers are trained to respond to young people, people experiencing emotional distress, and situations involving potential weapons. The case raised questions about whether officers have enough tools to de-escalate situations. Could the encounter have ended differently? Could more time have been taken? Could other options have been considered? These questions became part of broader discussions about modern policing. Another issue was accountability. Many communities asked whether police officers face the same legal standards as ordinary citizens. The conviction of Jason Van Dyke became significant because it demonstrated that an officer could be convicted for actions taken while on duty. For supporters of reform, the verdict represented progress. It showed that accountability was possible. It showed that the justice system could hold law enforcement officials responsible. But others argued that one conviction did not solve larger systemic problems. They believed the focus needed to extend beyond individual cases. They argued that policies, training, oversight, and institutional culture also required examination. The debate reflected a difficult reality. A single case can reveal problems. But solving those problems requires long-term effort. The impact of the Laquan McDonald case was also felt in discussions about journalism and public oversight. The role of investigative reporters became a major part of the story. Without persistent questions from journalists and legal challenges, the video might have remained hidden. The case demonstrated the importance of independent reporting. It showed that journalists can play a critical role in examining powerful institutions. They can ask questions when official explanations are incomplete. They can investigate when information is unavailable. They can bring attention to issues that might otherwise be ignored. For many people, the case became an example of how public pressure can create accountability. Citizens demanded answers. Activists organized. Legal organizations challenged government decisions. Together, these efforts changed the direction of the case. The national attention also affected conversations within police departments across the country. Departments reviewed policies involving use of force investigations. Officials examined how videos should be stored and released. Communities demanded clearer rules about transparency. The case became part of a broader movement toward greater accountability in law enforcement. But even as the case became a national symbol, it was important not to lose sight of the individual behind the headlines. Laquan McDonald was not born to become a symbol. He did not choose to represent a national debate. He was a teenager whose life ended unexpectedly. The meaning attached to his name came after his death. And while his case influenced important conversations, the personal tragedy remained. A family lost a son. A community lost a young person. A future disappeared. The national impact of the case came from the questions it forced people to ask. Questions that were uncomfortable. Questions that did not have easy answers. How should society respond when a young person is killed by someone with authority? How can communities trust institutions when they believe information was hidden? How can law enforcement maintain public safety while also protecting individual rights? How can justice systems ensure fairness while still demanding accountability? These questions continued long after the trial ended. Because the Laquan McDonald case was never only about one night in Chicago. It became part of a larger examination of how societies handle power. The power to use force. The power to control information. The power to shape public narratives. And the responsibility that comes with that power. The legacy of the case is complicated. Some see it as a warning about failures in transparency and accountability. Others see it as an example of the justice system eventually responding. Many see it as both. A tragedy that revealed problems. A conviction that demonstrated change was possible. A reminder that progress often comes after painful moments. Years later, The video remains one of the most recognizable pieces of evidence in discussions about police accountability. Not because people want to remember the violence, but because people remember what happened when the truth was finally visible. A camera captured the moment. The public demanded answers. The courts examined the evidence. And a city was forced to confront questions it could no longer avoid. The story of Laquan McDonald became larger than Chicago. It became a national reminder that accountability depends on more than laws. It depends on transparency. It depends on courage. It depends on the willingness to face difficult truths. Because sometimes the most important evidence is not hidden because it does not exist. Sometimes it is hidden because once people see it, everything changes.